A lot of people like to point out that John Williams stole his entire bag from a very specific work. Now, this is not true, of course, but it is interesting to point out the striking similarities between many of John Williams' most famous scores and a set of works from pre-1920. In fact, precisely 59 years before the very first Star Wars film in 1977, there was another set of works that might sound shockingly familiar. This is a movement from a suite called The Planets by Gustav Holst, and it was released in 1918. Holst was an English composer and arranger born in 1874, and The Planets is probably his most famous work. It is a suite consisting of 7 movements, all based on different planets. He left out Earth, for one, and Pluto, even though it's not a planet anymore, wasn't actually discovered until 1930, a full 12 years after the public release of the suite, and 47 years before the release of the very first Star Wars film. Now, why do I keep pointing out Star Wars? Well, check this out. As you can see, what was arguably extremely groundbreaking in the world of cinematic scores in 1977 was perhaps not necessarily as groundbreaking as you might have thought. Now, does this take away from the work of John Williams and Star Wars? Some people think it does. Personally, I think it does not. I am not necessarily put off when things borrow and are influenced even to this extent, which is significant. But some people do firmly believe that John Williams kind of just jacked Gustav Holst's entire book. So I'll start by sharing my point of view and saying that I don't think that that's true. I don't feel that way about John Williams' work. I recognize the amount of influence that The Planets had on much of John Williams' work, but I don't think it's fair to take away the genius and the timelessness of so much of what John Williams has done for the world of film. That's where I stand. But let's keep taking a look at some of these similarities because it is pretty incredible. Wow. You know, funny enough, this was actually met at its initial release in 1919 with some hostility. People didn't like it. Surprise, surprise, when something new happens throughout history, people kind of go, I don't like it. It was called noisy and pretentious, pompous and unalluring, and even a great disappointment, elaborately contrived and difficult to listen to, if you can imagine that. I think opinions on it were initially fairly split. I'm sure that many people loved it, and also a lot of the people who didn't like it initially wound up changing their tune. This whole suite is just absolutely incredible, and we get these moments of just unbelievable similarities to the modern cinematic universe that we know. Like, check this out. It's just crazy, but watch this. Check it out. It's the same chord. It's even in the same key. This is one of those things that I can almost guarantee you that John Williams did very intentionally as a nod II, clearly his greatest influence for this particular film. I don't think he was trying to write the same thing and pass it off as his own. I think that's a pretty blatant, like, hey, I'm going to use the same chord with the same quality and the same key and almost the exact same instrumentation and do that sort of same chord repeated in a drawn-out manner. I think that's very intentional to just kind of pay homage to what's, like, again, clearly the greatest influence for this soundtrack. But it's just an example of the many ways in which film, and especially John Williams, has drawn from these 7 movements of a suite that was born in the end of the First World War. Any ideas on what this might sound like? How about this? The Harry Potter soundtrack is another one of John Williams' timeless classics. I mean, John Williams had a knack for writing themes that we all kind of can sing along to. I mean, there are so many, composers that have done that. I mean, everybody knows the Lord of the Rings theme by Howard Shore, some of Hans Zimmer's work with, like, Pirates of the Caribbean. There are plenty of composers that are capable of doing this, but perhaps the person who has written the most melodies that we all kind of know and can sing along to, because movie scores don't always approach things that way. I mean, look at Hans Zimmer's work on Interstellar. It was completely a different approach. It was not as much about the melodies and the things that you might sing along to as much as it was the palette of sound. It's just a different approach to movie scores. It doesn't make it any, better or worse or less valid or whatever. It's just a different approach. But John Williams typically had this more melodic approach. That's why we know the Indiana Jones theme, the E.T. theme, the Jurassic Park theme, the Harry Potter theme, the Star Wars theme, the Superman theme. It just goes, the list just keeps going and going and going. It's just so unbelievably beautiful, and it would not sound even a little bit out of place in a scene from Harry Potter. It is exactly that same vibe. It's the same instrumentation, it's the same kind of mystical harmonic structure. You gotta check this out because it'll leave you listening just in a trance almost, just kind of not even sure where you are anymore. In fact, in 1918, following the public premiere, Holst's daughter wrote this about this particular movement, which was the end of the entire suite. But it was the end of Neptune that was unforgettable, with its hidden chorus of women's voices growing fainter and fainter in the distance, until the imagination knew no difference between sound and silence. This is what she's referring to. Imagine hearing this in 1918. You've never heard anything like it in your life. Things like this hadn't really been done before. And that's the ending to the concert. And it's about outer space, and it's about the planets of the solar system, and you're probably just sitting there without knowing how to even react. What an incredible depiction of the farthest, darkest planet that we knew so little about. Imagine, like, where your imagination would have gone. And they did that by having the singers off in the wings and then eventually moving them farther away and closing a door between the singers and the audience. I mean, imagine what that must have sounded like. It's just, like, incredible. And then you get things like Jupiter, which, tell me this just doesn't sound like every hero's theme ever. there are so many films that you could point to that sound something like that. While it's very easy to point out the incredible similarities between Gustav Holst's work and John Williams, he's not the only one that has been influenced by this work. In perhaps less obvious ways, these ideas and these styles pop up in so many film composers' works over the last 50 years. But perhaps one of the most significant and earliest usages of these influences is the Star Wars trilogy, beginning in 1977. And I think that John Williams is equal parts responsible as Gustav Holst in creating this style as becoming kind of the staple sound in so much cinematic work. While Gustav Holst paved the way with the ideas to begin with, John Williams took many of those influences and developed them into film scores and the themes that we know today, and that just kind of created a lot of what we now kind of look at as cinematic music. And of course, people have taken from that and done many, many different things, as you do in music. But it will always be a little bit shocking and surreal to me to think that Star Wars, in some ways, was written 60 years before Star Wars. And that so much of what we understand as being sort of a cinematic style today comes from a lot earlier than we typically think. Gustav Holst is one of those names that, in the music world, many of us are familiar with him and with the planets and the incredible works that they are. But in the wider world of music, and especially cinematic music, I think he kind of goes under the radar and is often not really recognized for the amount of credit he's due. So if there's one thing you should take away from this, go check out The Planets by Gustav Holst. Listen to the whole thing in its entirety at once, if you can, because it is an incredible experience, and you are definitely going to hear so many bits and pieces that will sound oddly familiar. And that's because he really paved the way with a lot of ideas that would ultimately become modern cinematic music. What other scores do you know of that you've maybe made connections to Gustav Holst's work? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to kind of find some of those more specific instances where people have been influenced by The Planets and maybe have used bits and pieces of it in their own cinematic work. But that is going to do it for me today. If you wouldn't mind giving the video a thumbs up if you liked it, that helps out a ton with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe if you haven't already. As always, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.